This video is brought to you by the third edition of Brexit the Colouring Book. Relive the whole process, the TLDR team's analysis, get an exclusive video, have a little colour, and support the channel by picking up a copy and get a never for sale number 10 pin free with your purchase by clicking the link in the description. In the aftermath of the Owen Paterson saga, we thought it'd be a good time to do a video documenting all the times the current government has ignored instructions from an independent body, because there have been a fair few cases in the last couple of years. So before we get into it, some disclaimers. First, this isn't intended as a partisan video. We're not just doing this video as a hit piece on the Conservatives, we'd do it whoever was in power. We're just doing it because this sort of thing is important to cover, whatever side of the political aisle it comes from, because it implies a rebalancing of power in British politics, which the public should know about. In ignoring and undermining independent checks and balances, the government is becoming more powerful. Second, to make sure this video is fair, we're not just going to do a list of all the quote sleazy things the government has done. We're only going to look at cases where the government has ignored and undermined an independent body. Again, sticking to this relatively strict definition will hopefully help us to avoid any bias. Anyway, disclaimers aside, let's get into it. Over the last week, the Conservatives have been hit by at least a couple of sleaze scandals. First, there was the Owen Paterson affair, when the government tried to protect Conservative MP Owen Paterson after the Standards Commission recommended he be suspended for 30 days. And second, there was the report in the Sunday Times that suggested the Conservatives had been selling peerages to their treasurers for £3 million a pop. This is translated into a drop in support for the Conservatives, who, according to the most recent Ipsos Mori poll, are now actually a point behind Labour. When asked about it on Andrew Marr, Keir Starmer insisted that these weren't just isolated incidents. Boris Johnson and the Conservatives actually have a habit of this sort of thing.
Owen Paterson was lobbying the government on behalf of a company that was paying him hundreds of thousands of pounds, and along comes the Prime Minister. Instead of upholding standards, he orders his MPs to protect his mate and rip up the whole system. And it's not a one-off. This Prime Minister has form, he has pattern. There are so many examples. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, was found to have breached the ministerial code. What happened? She stayed. The advisor had to go. The Electoral Commission started looking at the government. What happened? The government's trying to clip its wings, and now there's been this outrageous undermining of Catherine Stone, the independent commissioner, in this very case. It's a pattern of behaviour.
And, well, Starmer has a point. This isn't a partisan point. It's simply a fact that Boris Johnson's government has a track record of ignoring and undermining independent actors. Now, to be fair, occasionally it might be appropriate to ignore independent advice. No process is perfect after all, but when it becomes a regular occurrence, then chances are you're not really worried about the quality of the process. You just don't like checks and balances on your power, which is why we thought it was worth covering. Anyway, we've had a look through the archive and found 6 such cases excluding the Owen Paterson affair, a couple of which were mentioned by Starmer in that interview. 3 of these have already happened, and 3 of these are in the works. Let's start with the ones that have already happened. They are, in chronological order, number 1, ignoring the advice of the Permanent Secretary to the Government Legal Department, Sir Jonathan Jones, in September 2020. Number 2, ignoring the advice of Ethics Advisor Sir Alex Allen in November 2020. And number 3, ignoring the advice of the House of Lords Appointments Commission in December 2020. Let's start with Jonathan Jones. Essentially, back in the Brexit days, the government's top legal advisor and solicitor to the Treasury, Sir Jonathan Jones, advised the government that their plans to overwrite parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol in the UK-EU Brexit deal with the Internal Markets Bill would violate international law. The previous Attorney General, Sir Geoffrey Cox, had agreed with Jones, but he'd been sacked by the government for, well, wanting to abide by international law. But the new Attorney General, Suella Braverman, told the government to go ahead with it against Jones's advice.
I would say to my honourable friend that yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way. We are taking the power to disapply the EU law concept of direct effect required by Article 4 in a certain very tightly defined circumstance.
When the government did indeed decide to break international law in a specific and limited way, Jones resigned. On to Sir Alex Allen. Sir Alex was the government's ethics advisor, which essentially means that his job was advising the government when a minister had broken the ministerial code. Back in November of last year, he advised the government that Home Secretary Priti Patel had breached the ministerial code of conduct for bullying civil servants, and should therefore resign. Boris Johnson disagreed or ignored the advice, kept Patel in place, and Sir Alex resigned. Finally, the House of Lords Appointment Commission. Technically, the Queen appoints Lords on the advice of the Prime Minister. In practice, this basically means that the Prime Minister has historically had the power to appoint whoever they want to the Lords. This is obviously an imperfect system. It means the Prime Minister can just cram the Lords full of their mates to make sure they always have a majority in the House of Lords to get through what they want. To protect against abuses of this sort, in 2000, Tony Blair introduced the House of Lords Appointment Commission, an independent body who monitored appointments to the Lords, by basically vetoing candidates who weren't appropriate. This system worked relatively well until December last year, when Boris Johnson became the first Prime Minister to ever overrule the Commission when he gave a peerage to Peter Cruddas, former Conservative Party donor and Treasurer who'd been vetoed by the Commission for offering access to David Cameron and George Osborne for cash in 2012, in what's now known as the Cash for Access scandal. So those are the three cases that have already happened. The three cases that are in the works are: Number 1, undermining the Electoral Commission. Number 2, undermining judicial review. And Number 3, ignoring the Ofcom Chair's advisory committee. Let's start with the Electoral Commission. Created in 2001, the Electoral Commission is responsible for monitoring political parties' finances and donations. It's currently investigating Boris Johnson over the financing of his Downing Street flat refurbishment, £58,000 of which was allegedly paid for by a Conservative donor, a potential violation of the Electoral Commission rules. Anyway, Johnson's government is currently pushing through the Elections Bill, which would strip the Electoral Commission of its power to bring prosecutions, making them relatively powerless to enforce the rules, and let the government direct the Commission in accordance with the government's priorities via a strategy and policy statement, whatever that means. Anyway, on to judicial review. Judicial review is basically when a court reviews the lawfulness of an action made by a public body, like the government. Judicial review hasn't been too kind to Johnson. For example, the Supreme Court ruled that his prorogation of Parliament was unlawful. Originally, the government were planning to limit judicial review via so-called ouster clauses, which basically say the courts can't investigate the government on certain matters. The government have apparently backtracked somewhat, at least according to the first draft of the Judicial Review and Courts Bill, which only has an ouster clause specifically for the judicial review of controversial immigration clauses. Nonetheless, the bill's only at the committee stage, which means there's plenty of time for things to change. The final case we're going to be looking at is Ofcom. Ofcom is the UK's media regulator, and it's had some control over the content that appears on our screens. For the last year, they've been looking for a new chair, and the government's preferred candidate is Paul Dacre, former Daily Mail editor and arch-Brexiteer. Unfortunately for the government, the independent panel that conducted the interview deemed Dacre unappointable. The government's way around this was to, just restart the entire process, with a new panel and no restrictions on applicants reapplying. Anyway, those are the 6 cases of Johnson's government undermining independent bodies. As we mentioned at the start of this video, we're doing this because a pattern of undermining independent bodies suggests that Johnson just doesn't like checks and balances, and it's important that people know that the balance of power in British politics is being shifted towards the Prime Minister. This should also act as a reminder that in British politics, if the Prime Minister has a stable majority, at the end of the day, they can do basically whatever they want, and the only real limits on their power are political. Like I said at the start of the video, you can support the channel by getting yourself or a friend a copy of Brexit the Colouring Book. The book contains 25 images of the Brexit process, as well as custom commentary from the TLDR team and a never released video, so even if you're not into colouring, hopefully you can enjoy it. Anyway, right now you can get a number 10 Downing Street pin with your book absolutely free if you click the link below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we post a video. And special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name listed at the end of videos just like these people, then be sure to back us on Patreon.